The crowd erupted, a sea of voices rising to a fever pitch as two titans prepared to clash in an arena that had seen its fair share of legends. But this fight? This one was different. It wasn't just a battle of skill or strategy, it was a collision of eras, a meeting between the ferocity of a former champion and the poised precision of a rising star. The stage was set, but the question remained. Could the power of a legend like Mike Tyson overcome the calm but ruthless technique of Leon Edwards? Tyson, known for his bone-shaking punches and his unrelenting desire to destroy anything in his path, was a name that echoed through the annals of boxing history. His reign as the youngest heavyweight champion was something of legend, a time when the world watched in awe as his fists hit harder than most could imagine. But as time passed, Tyson's career was defined not only by his victories, but by the personal demons that haunted him, the struggles that led to his eventual fall from grace. Yet, despite all of that, his name still struck fear into the hearts of anyone who heard it. Enter Leon Edwards, a fighter whose rise in the UFC was both calculated and methodical. Known for his calm demeanor inside the octagon, Edwards had earned the respect of the MMA world with his sharp, technical approach. His fight against Kamaru Usman had solidified his place at the top of the welterweight division, but standing in front of Tyson, Edwards found himself facing an entirely different kind of challenge. It wasn't just about precision and endurance anymore. It was about surviving against someone whose power could change the course of a fight in the blink of an eye. As the fighters prepared for the biggest test of their careers, each man brought his own strategy. Tyson, with his unmatched experience, was determined to prove that despite his age, he could still dominate anyone who dared to step into his world. Edwards, on the other hand, knew that the key to beating Tyson wasn't just in landing strikes. It was about avoiding those deadly punches and finding a way to exploit the gaps in Tyson's aging defense. The first bell rang, and for a moment, it seemed as if time itself had paused. Tyson, though older, still moved with the aggression of a man half his age, his eyes locked on Edwards with the intensity of a predator. But Edwards wasn't intimidated. He had faced some of the toughest competition in the world and survived. He knew his game plan: patience, timing, and exploiting every opening. The exchange between the two was unlike any fight the crowd had ever seen. Tyson, despite his age, unleashed a flurry of punches that seemed to come from nowhere, each one carrying the kind of power that could shatter a man's resolve. Edwards, with his fluid movements, was able to avoid the worst of the storm, darting in and out of range, landing quick strikes to Tyson's head and body. But Tyson was relentless, and his every move was calculated to break his opponent down mentally and physically. For those watching, it was a spectacle of contrast. Tyson, the ferocious former champion, versus Edwards, the composed strategist, each seeking to prove who truly belonged at the top. With each passing round, the stakes grew higher, the tension mounting with every exchange. Tyson's punches, though slower than they once were, still carried the threat of devastation. Edwards, who had proven his resilience in the face of adversity, was now up against a monster, a fighter whose reputation for ending fights in seconds was still very much intact. But then, something unexpected happened. Just as Tyson seemed to be gaining momentum, Edwards found his rhythm. He avoided another powerful right hook and, with surgical precision, landed a counter that rocked Tyson back on his heels. The crowd held its breath. Could Tyson, who had always dominated, be on the verge of defeat? The bell rang again, signaling the end of another round, but the story was far from over. Tyson's eyes, fierce and unrelenting, told a different story, one of a man who had seen it all and wasn't ready to give up just yet. Edwards, though visibly calm, knew he couldn't afford to let up. The fight had become more than just a battle for victory. It was a war of attrition. And in this war, no one was guaranteed a win. The arena buzzed with anticipation as the fighters returned to their corners, the tension palpable. Tyson's camp whispered words of encouragement, reminding him of the power that still resided in his fists. Edwards, on the other hand, took a moment to gather his thoughts, his focus laser sharp. The next round was about to begin, and the question remained, who would emerge victorious from this epic showdown? The second round began with a new energy in the air, the atmosphere heavy with expectation. The fighters were back at it, but something had shifted in the rhythm of the fight. Tyson, though clearly not the fighter he once was, began to show signs of desperation. His attacks, while still brutal, lacked the sharpness they once had. He was wild at times, swinging with reckless abandon, and it was clear that the aging warrior was trying to prove to himself and the world that he still had the killer instinct that had once made him invincible. Edwards, for his part, had adjusted to Tyson's onslaught. His movements were smooth, calculated, his every step in the ring designed to avoid the power that Tyson could unleash. But he wasn't just dancing around the punches. Edwards was starting to land with more frequency, his strikes hitting with precision that Tyson had not been prepared for. Each shot seemed to weaken the former champion, but Tyson's resolve remained firm. Despite the growing evidence that Edwards was gaining the upper hand, Tyson's will to fight was undeniable. Then, in the blink of an eye, the unexpected happened. As Tyson lunged forward with what appeared to be a knockout blow, something in his movement faltered. A grimace crossed his face, his knee buckling for just a moment. The crowd fell silent, confused. Was it a momentary misstep? Or was Tyson hurt? Edwards paused, his face betraying nothing, but the momentary hesitation was all Tyson needed to reset his stance and continue. The old warrior wasn't about to let an injury stop him, but the damage was done. He was no longer the same Tyson who had once knocked out opponents with the mere thought of his fists. The incident sparked a change in the flow of the fight. Edwards now knew that he could exploit Tyson's weakness. It wasn't just about avoiding punches. It was about exploiting every opening, testing the limits of Tyson's resolve. The younger fighter's strategy became clear. He wasn't just trying to survive anymore. He was trying to break Tyson down, piece by piece, and make him realize that the clock had run out. But Tyson wasn't finished yet. After a brief exchange of glances, something shifted in his eyes. The fire was back, more intense than before. He had been hurt, but it wasn't the first time in his life that adversity had knocked him to his knees. Tyson's comeback wasn't just about strength, it was about pride. Pride that no opponent could take away, no matter how young or fast they were. And with a roar, Tyson launched himself at Edwards, his punches coming faster, heavier, and with a ferocity that seemed to defy his age. Just as Tyson closed in, seemingly set to turn the tide, a new wrinkle appeared in the story. Edwards, in a swift, unexpected move, evaded Tyson's right hook and landed a brutal knee to the champion's midsection. Tyson grunted, stumbling back as the air was knocked from his lungs. But it wasn't just the knee that made the crowd gasp. It was the audible sound of Tyson's corner, shouting in panic. Tyson wasn't just physically hurt. There was something deeper going on, something far more dangerous. The shockwaves from the blow sent Tyson reeling, but as he recovered, his hands began to shake. It wasn't the exhaustion or the pain, it was something more. A stark realization hit the audience like a punch to the gut. Tyson's body, once a finely tuned weapon, was beginning to betray him. The years of wear and tear, the toll of a brutal career, had taken its toll. And now, as Edwards pressed the attack, Tyson seemed more vulnerable than ever before. In that moment, Edwards didn't just see his opportunity, he felt it. But there was a hesitation in him now, a flicker of doubt. Was Tyson truly broken, or was this a trap? A part of Edwards still couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just an ordinary fight. Tyson's career had been built on comebacks from the brink of defeat, and the young fighter knew all too well how dangerous a wounded animal could be. The tension between the two men was palpable. Every strike that landed seemed to carry the weight of a decision, a choice that could end the fight or cost them everything. As Tyson's leg buckled again, he seemed to lose his footing, yet he quickly regained his balance with a grimace. His corner screamed for him to stay focused, to remember who he was. The crowd held its collective breath, caught between disbelief and admiration. Tyson, though clearly in trouble, wasn't willing to back down. He was a man who had spent years at the top of the combat sports world, and no amount of pain or time could erase the fire that burned inside him. But Edwards was a man on the rise, and the danger of underestimating him was now very real. The next moments unfolded with blistering speed. Edwards, sensing Tyson's vulnerability, pressed forward with the precision of a surgeon. His jabs found their mark. His kicks seemed to land with greater authority. Tyson's defense, which had once been unshakable, now had visible cracks. Each exchange between the two fighters felt more significant, more final. Would Tyson be able to summon one last act of defiance, or was the future of the sport already in the hands of a new champion? The crowd could only watch, their excitement mingled with fear as the ultimate showdown reached its boiling point. But as the bell rang, signaling the end of another round, the third round began, but there was no longer any pretense of a fair fight. Tyson's steps were heavy now, each one an effort, his punches slower, more telegraphed. Edwards had the taste of victory in his mouth, yet there was something about Tyson's presence that refused to let him fully breathe easy. The former champion, despite his aging body, still carried a certain aura, one that demanded respect. As the two fighters circled each other, it felt as though time had momentarily stopped, the crowd in a hushed silence, waiting for what would come next. Edwards threw a quick jab to Tyson's jaw, but it wasn't enough to put him away. Tyson, driven by nothing but sheer will, fired back with a left hook that landed with a crack, knocking Edwards back. For a split second, the world seemed to tilt on its axis. Was this the moment that Tyson would pull off the unimaginable and conquer the young lion in front of him? The entire arena held its breath, but Edwards recovered quickly, his composure never faltering, and launched a devastating kick to Tyson's ribs that sent the veteran stumbling. The clock was ticking down, and both fighters were giving everything they had. But in those final moments, Tyson seemed to make a decision, one that was not driven by strategy or survival. It was something deeper, more primal. His body, worn and battered, struggled to obey his will. And then, something in his posture shifted, a sign that he was about to push past his limits. It wasn't just about winning anymore. It was about proving that no matter how broken a man might seem, he could still stand tall. He summoned every ounce of his remaining strength, closing the gap between himself and Edwards, aiming for one last powerful blow. But Edwards was ready. The young fighter had been watching Tyson closely, studying his every move. And as Tyson lunged forward with everything he had, Edwards saw the opening. In a move so fluid it seemed almost instinctual, he ducked under Tyson's swing, sidestepping him with a grace that Tyson couldn't match. In that same moment, Edwards brought his knee up, landing a crushing blow to Tyson's chin. Tyson's eyes flashed in surprise, his body going limp as he hit the mat. The roar of the crowd was deafening, but it wasn't just the sound of triumph, it was a mixture of awe and disbelief. The man who had once ruled the ring, whose name had been synonymous with domination, was on the ground, his legacy now hanging in the balance. Edwards stood over him, his chest heaving, his mind still processing what had just happened. He hadn't just defeated Tyson. He had survived against a fighter who had crushed legends. In that moment, it wasn't just about skill, it was about heart. Tyson's legacy was undeniable, but Edwards had written his own chapter in the history books. As the referee moved in, signaling the end of the fight, Tyson slowly lifted his head, his eyes locking with Edwards. There was no bitterness, no shame, only a quiet nod of acknowledgement. Tyson had been beaten, but in that defeat, he saw the torch being passed, not just from one fighter to another, but from one era to the next. The bell rang, and the crowd erupted again. But this time, the cheers weren't just for the victor, they were for the spectacle they had just witnessed. Tyson, though defeated, had shown the world that he was more than just a legend. He was a symbol of perseverance, of what it means to fight when everything inside you says to give up. And Edwards? He had proven that even in the shadow of greatness, a new champion could rise. As Edwards raised his hand in victory, the camera zoomed in on Tyson. His face was bruised, but there was something in his eyes, something that told the world he had never truly been finished. His journey might have been coming to an end, but his impact would live on. The final twist came not in the result of the fight, but in the realization that, in the end, both men had fought for something far greater than titles or records. They fought for their legacies, and both had secured their places in history. As Edwards made his way to the locker room, the thoughts of the crowd still echoed in his mind. This was a fight for the ages. And in that moment, he realized that the greatest battles were not always won in the ring. Sometimes they were won in the heart.